Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Silva. Before you watch this next video, I wanted to record a brief prologue. I almost didn't post it because I recorded it some time ago, but when I was editing it, I started to get bogged down in the details, and I thought, this is too esoteric. This playlist is about esoteric OCD symptoms that you're not going to hear about anywhere else. They're not talked about anywhere else. You have to be an OCD sufferer, as I myself am, in order to really appreciate them. They're very nuanced, they're highly esoteric. But as I was recording, I thought, this is too esoteric. And then it occurred to me that what's important are not the details. What's important are the concepts. And so I went ahead, I'm gonna post this video, I'm gonna let people watch it. And my hope is that other people with OCD will in fact identify with the concepts, because that's what's important. The idea that OCD, like a lot of anxiety, can be covert, that even individuals who understand their diagnosis and who maybe have some textbook symptoms can overlook when their behavior is being driven by this condition, by this disorder. And there are a lot of behaviors, weird things that I do or don't do that are because of my OCD that took me a long time to identify. And so if you look in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, if you look at the diagnostic criteria for this disorder, you see a brief section on the O and a brief section on the C, obsessions and compulsions. And it's very textbook, it's very literally defined, but there's so much more that goes into OCD. There's so much more nuance, and the symptoms are really multifaceted. So it's my hope that this series will speak to those individuals out there. I know you're out there, and you may be in the minority, but I do think that there are other people who will identify with what I'm saying. And I encourage you to leave comments. Please share your own experiences. If you have symptoms that you think fall under the OCD umbrella, but that no one else is talking about, please share those. I think it would be enlightening. Try not to get bogged down on the specific examples I give and focus on the ideas. And I do have captions highlighting those important ideas and those important concepts and terms, that anxiety is not always obvious, that it can be subliminal, that you might not even recognize that what's driving your behavior is indeed anxiety because you're not consciously worried about anything. But if you really look at it, it is anxiety that's making you do or not do what you're doing or not doing. That anxiety masquerades, it hides, it doesn't want to be diagnosed, it doesn't want to be treated. It almost like cancer, it's almost like it has a mind of its own. That OCD behavior is irrational. And that's a huge clue that OCD is calling the shots. It feels like you're doing the right thing, but it's really often the lesser of two evils, where one evil is completely imaginary. It's the OCD that you're trying to skirt around, that you're beholden to. And so you're doing something that's irrational because the lesser of two evils, you're doing something that's inconvenient or that doesn't make sense or that's crazy or it's wasteful, or you're holding on to junk if you're a hoarder, but that feels more right than actually throwing away that piece of garbage. This is the hoarding example, because there is an OCD element that's telling you that that would be worse, and it's crazy. That is one extreme example, but there are a lot of examples that are in that vein. Concepts like not taking action is tantamount to compulsive behavior, that it often takes as much energy and determination as actually doing something. Not doing something also involves that same tension that OCD sufferers feel, the same tension that tic sufferers feel when they're trying to resist biting their nails or cracking their knuckles or pulling on their hair. And so the question that we should be asking ourselves is, where does the tension lie? If you're feeling that tension, if you can be cognizant of it, if you can be aware of it, and then recognize, oh, yeah, it's my OCD. It's my OCD making me feel uncomfortable. I'm squirming at the prospect, and it's not real. And that we tend to rationalize our motives, our intentions, and our very behaviors. We make up some plausible explanation that is logical, because if someone shines a light on what we're doing or not doing, it is not logical. It does not make sense. Another disclaimer, in the video, I talk about there's but one specifier to OCD, that OCD has one modifier, with or without insight. And I make that point in the video, and I just want to put a finer point on that. In the DSM, there are actually 3 categories. The first being, quote unquote, with good or fair insight. They lump those 2 together. And that indicates that the individual with OCD recognizes that the OCD beliefs, i.e. the intrusive, often morbid beliefs that are compelling certain behaviors, that they're not true. Either that they are definitely or probably not true, or that they may or may not be true. That's good and fair insight. The second specifier is poor insight, and that's in which the individual thinks that the beliefs are probably true. And then the third category is absent insight/delusional beliefs, in which case the individual is completely convinced that if he doesn't wash his hands 30 times, that he's going to develop COVID, for an example. So those are actually the insight specifiers, actually 3 categories. And then there is a second category of specifier, which is tick-related. You specify if the condition is tick-related because there is an association with tick disorder. And finally, and this is my OCD, I apologize for the light show. As you can see, I have finally fixed that problem, but this was recorded several weeks ago and I was still having issues with the lighting. It also explains some of the flashier transitions, pun intended. So anyway, thank you guys for listening, and without further ado, super esoteric OCD symptoms. Hey, this is Dr. Silva with the next installment on the esoteric OCD symptoms. And so this playlist is about obsessive compulsive disorder, but specifically it's about symptoms that aren't really talked about very much, that aren't really known. It's not the hand washing and the counting that we all know about. These are more esoteric symptoms. And this playlist is inspired by the fact that I myself suffer from OCD, and there are things that I've noticed over the years that are a part of OCD that a lot of them, it took me a while to even realize it was my OCD at work, because it's not obvious that it's anxiety that's driving the behavior. I'm not necessarily nervous and certainly nowhere near overwhelmed, but it is that sense of unease if I were to do things a different way that drives my behavior. When I really look at the behavior is irrational. And so over the years, I've gotten better at identifying my OCD. And so the things that we all know about safety and cleanliness and attention to symmetry and organization, these things that make us feel good, also collecting things. I have another video on hoarding, the hoarding instinct. That's not so esoteric. People have heard about it. But the one I'm going to talk about today, I don't even know what to call it. It's so esoteric. And I thought about coining a word for it. It would have to be something to do with doing things the hard way. The Latin or Greek for being your own worst pain in the ass. And another aspect of it is a reluctance to disengage from whatever it is you're doing in that moment. An aversion to breaking the routine that you're in, because that is where the tension lies. That's where the anxiety lies. It has to do with deviating from not necessarily even like a ritual, like an established routine that you do all the time, but more to the point what you're doing in that moment. This is so esoteric. And it'd be interesting to know if other people out there with OCD have experienced this, or if this even sounds remotely familiar, or am I truly the only one? I have had other things in the past that I thought I was the only one, and then I would hear celebrities and other people talk about it and think, we're not that unique. Our brains are the same. And certainly if I'm having this, out of the millions, tens or hundreds of millions of people out there that have OCD, certainly other people are also experiencing this as well. And I encourage people to please use the comments section to share your experiences. I had a conversation with a patient today who was suffering from a migraine. She doesn't get migraines very often, maybe one every 3 or 4 months. And so she doesn't take medication to prevent migraines, prophylactic medication. But when I asked what medication she was taking for the pain that she was having right there behind this eye, and she looked unwell. She looked unrested, even though she had had a good night's sleep. She denied that she was groggy. She'd been up since 6 in the morning and it was almost 11. And so I was asking her why she seemed tired and her voice was groggy. And it's because she was having a migraine, a splitting headache. When I asked what she had taken to alleviate the pain, the answer was nothing. Not even over-the-counter Tylenol or ibuprofen. And it was easy enough for her to rationalize that those medications don't really help. It was easy for her to rationalize that Tylenol and ibuprofen, that they don't work anyway. And we had a discussion about, well, maybe they don't take the pain away completely, but they can only help. It may be helping and it may be shortening the length of time that you're having this headache. But she didn't even want it to be called a migraine. So this is what I'm trying to get at. She had anxiety is really what it was, this subliminal anxiety about, I don't want to suffer from migraine headaches. Ergo, I don't want a diagnosis of migraines, so I don't want to call what I'm having a migraine, even though she had a family history of migraine, both a sister and a brother, and it was a unilateral headache that gets better when she goes into a dark room, when she gets away from the light. But she didn't even want it to be a migraine. And so going and taking medicine is all part of the same syndrome of not wanting it to be something, having an irrational reason for not going and trying to get as much pain relief as possible. And it became even clearer when I offered her tramadol, which is a prescription-only, weak opiate medication that is much stronger than Tylenol, but she didn't want the prescription. And it was, again, wrapped up with this whole thing of, I don't even want to have this happening. Almost like a denial of sorts. And it was also the idea of taking another medicine, of having to take medicine. And I had to remind her, this would be once every 3 or 4 months, 3 or 4 times a year. It would be just to have it in the medicine cabinet and not even take it. Just to have it as an option. And ultimately, I told her I was going to prescribe it, and it was up to her whether she would go fill it or not. But I pointed out that the resistance that she had to it was because of OCD tendencies. She doesn't have a formal diagnosis of OCD, but she gave me a few other symptoms that could fall under OCD. And this, I had identified this as a very subtle, irrational, anxiety-driven behavior choices that she was making, reluctance. It was a reluctance. That's a better word than anxiety. But, anxiety underlies that reluctance. And it was also evident when I said, well, why don't you go ahead and take some medicine? I recommend that you go ahead and take some Tylenol. I'm going to recommend that to you because you're having a migraine. And she said, well, I won't take anything now. We'll see if this pain is still with me at 5 o'clock, then I'll take some medicine. And I had to stop her there and say, listen to what you're saying. You're going to choose to be in pain for hours more, for another 6 hours. And if you've been suffering all day long, then you'll go and get some Tylenol. Well, that is completely irrational. It makes absolutely no sense. If you use the logic, it is absolutely crazy. And I use that word with affection, I always say. Because if the Tylenol is going to work or not work, take it now. You're hurting now. Why wait? But it's what her mind came up with to rationalize her irrational decision to not take medication that might help, that might make her feel a little better. It was the reluctance to admit that she was having a migraine, the reluctance to take medicine, period, and then the idea that, well, it doesn't help, it doesn't take it away anyway. So why would I want to take a medication into my body that's unnecessary and blah, 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 all these other things. And all she could do was frown in response. And I could just see the reluctance, and the answers that she was giving me, the rationalizations she was giving me made no sense at all. That's an esoteric symptom. Not wanting to do something that you know is probably going to help because of an inertia. There's an inertia that has to do with breaking the routine that you're in that moment, Because a related symptom is when I need to take care of something comes up and I need to take care of it. It would behoove me. I would have to interrupt my current activity, whatever that is. It's not necessarily anything important, but a lot of times I'll be doing something and there's a tension that you feel when you have an OCD compulsion come up. It's like the tension that you feel biting your nails or cracking your knuckles. It's exactly the same thing. It's the same mechanism. People that have OCD tend to have tics. And so you feel sort of this tension involved in just the idea of doing what is logical and reasonable and rational, but would involve going out of my way, would involve interrupting what is already. And just to give you another example, I know I'm having a hard time describing this, but that's because it's esoteric and also it's completely crazy. It's just hard to even put it into words, but I can tell you what the ideas are. So if I'm working on something, a collage, say for example, and I have placed a piece, an item, and it's perfectly placed and I'm very happy with it. But then in continuing to work on this work of art later, this is an actual example from my life. I have another piece and I have the place where it will go perfectly, it will fit perfectly, and it will be in harmony with all of the other pieces that I've already placed, etc. But to get to that spot is partially blocked by the piece I've already placed. And it's not like they're super glued, okay? So it would be very easy for me to remove this piece temporarily and then place it, and that would be the logical thing to do. That way, when I place the new piece, I'm not having to try to put a ship in a bottle type thing with pinchers and unnaturally bending and making it harder on myself. And yet I will do it that way. I will do it the hard way. I'm loath, even if it's hanging from a string, this is really crazy, to just move it to one side. I'm not even like ungluing it or untaping it. I'm just moving it to one side so that I can place the new piece. I'm loath to even do that. And the reason is because the first piece is perfectly placed. And there's no way that I can remove it and then put it back so that it will be exactly the way it is now. And here's the rub. I can put it back where it is as close as possible and to the point where I myself will not be able to tell the difference. But I'll know that it might be a fraction of a millimeter off, because when you replace it, there's just no way that it's going to be exactly the way it is now. And it's perfect now. And so if it's perfect now, even though this other piece would go perfectly partially behind it, I'm loath to muck up what is perfect. Just like not writing in those blank books, if you guys watched Hoarding. It's the same principle. And so I will crane around and I'll be all bent over and using forceps if I have to not disrupt what is already perfect. So it is about inertia. It's about not wanting to disrupt what is already there. It's about not wanting to stop and go do something else and then come back to what you're doing, even though you know you need to. It's very strange. Another reason that we will not do things, I say we, I hope it's not just me, but another reason is that there's a sense of futility. Just like my patient who wouldn't go because she was convinced that it wouldn't make a difference anyway, which she's probably wrong about that, at least partially. But there is a sense of futility that I need to go do this, I need to go try to go do this, but it's probably not going to help anyway. So that makes me even less likely to want to do it. But really, at the end of the day, it's about doing things the hard way. It is about being in pain for hours and hours and hours before you finally go and take that. And taking medicine is a good example, because that's happened to me. That's why I was able to identify it so readily, because there have been times where I am in pain and I'm working on something and I know I need to get up and go take my Lyrica, but it involves stopping because it's not just right here and I have to go upstairs and get it out of the medicine cabinet. But it is ultimately, at the end of the day, doing things the hard way. And the last thing I'll say is that in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, OCD has but one modifier. The conditions, the illnesses in that book have different modifiers. So major depression, recurrent, severe, with or without psychotic features, with anxious distress, that sort of thing. For OCD, the modifiers are with good insight or without. So you have OCD and either you have good insight or you don't have good insight, meaning that you understand your symptoms, that you understand you have a condition and that you recognize the symptom for what it is in all of its glory. And OCD symptoms are very interesting. Even the ones that are fairly common are multifaceted. And you really almost have to experience it to fully appreciate the different facets in your own mind that enshrine a particular behavior or a particular reluctance toward a behavior, and any sort of mental ritual as well, including the compulsion to think about something, i.e. an obsession. Tell yourself to stop, but then your mind keeps turning back to it over and over and over and over because you have a chemical imbalance. You need medication. But my patient didn't want to take medicine for her migraine headache, and she didn't have insight into that. First of all, she wasn't stopping to think about it. If she had, which I prompted her to do, the answer that came immediately to mind is Tylenol doesn't work anyway. But it's not totally rational not to try. And then she was going to wait hours and hours and hours. And then she initially declined a prescription for me that I told her was a lot stronger than Tylenol. So it's not about what works and what doesn't work. It's about not wanting to take medicine for a migraine headache because she doesn't want to have migraine headaches, even though she's in the middle of one. And so that's OCD without insight. She didn't have insight to begin with. And I broke it down for her, and she understood exactly what I was saying. We talked about other symptoms that she has that kind of fall under the umbrella of OCD as well. And she ended up having good insight. But that's an interesting thing about these particular symptoms that are very esoteric, is that there may not be insight for some of these. Even patients who know they have OCD and accept the diagnosis of OCD, and they know here's the symptoms that they have, they may have other symptoms that are so subtle, that are so intermittent, that are not classic in terms of textbook, that they don't have insight into those symptoms. I certainly had symptoms that I didn't know were part of OCD, even after I was diagnosed with OCD, which I had to be diagnosed by a colleague, and I was already a psychiatrist who'd been practicing for at least a decade. I knew that I had OCD traits. And of course I had OCD, full-blown. It's mild to moderate, but how could I not have seen it in myself? Well, for one thing, we all have a blind spot for ourselves, but also OCD, like other anxiety syndromes, is sneaky. Anxiety hides, it masquerades as other things. It doesn't want to be diagnosed, and then it doesn't want to be treated. And so I had to be diagnosed. And then even after I was diagnosed, there were symptoms that didn't come to light. Anyway, thank you for listening, and comments are always welcome.